Welcome back to Life's Chillin'. My name is Avital, and this week's Parshat is Parshat Mishpatim. And as the name sort of indicates, Parshat Mishpatim really focuses on laws, and it focuses on commandments. There are 613 commandments, and in this week's Parsha, we receive 53 of them, which is quite a big portion. And the laws are mostly pretty technical, talking about damages and property and interactions with other humans. But there are two sort of connected verses, one following the other, where really we're seeing a lot of emotion coming out of God. And I thought it was quite an interesting thing. So I'm going to read those verses to you. The first one says, "You shall not taunt or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not cause pain to any widow or orphan. If you dare cause him pain, ... exclamation point, which tends to mean God's wrath. For if he shall cry out to me, I shall surely hear his outcry. My wrath shall blaze, and I shall kill you by the sword, and your wives will be widows and your children orphans." So that's a really strong emotional verse that both talks about the exodus from Egypt and God instructing us to be kind to the stranger, and it talks about God also saying that we need to be kind to the orphan and the widow because God cares and will hear their cry and will seek vengeance if we're not kind to them. And then the second verse where God shows emotion immediately follows this one, and it says, "When you lend money to my people, to the poor person who is with you, do not act towards him as a creditor. Do not lay interest upon him. If you take your fellow's garment as security, until sunset shall you return it to him. For it alone is his clothing, it is his garment for his skin. In what shall he lie down? So it will be that if he cries out to me, I shall listen, for I am compassionate." So very interesting. Here it's saying that basically if you took somebody's garment as security for the loan that you gave them, you have to return to them at sunset because they're going to need those clothing to sleep in. And what else do they have? And if they cry out to God, that God's going to be compassionate to them because God hears their cries. So in both of these, about the widow, the stranger, and the orphan, and here about the poor person who has borrowed money, God is showing that he is listening to their cries and that he is compassionate. What's really beautiful here is that the Torah is telling us that God hears the cries of those who are oppressed and those who are most overlooked. And so when you look back at the first portion that we saw there that talked about the stranger, that we need to, it said, "You shall not taunt or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." That how can we fail to be welcoming, to be compassionate to a stranger when we know exactly what it was like to be a stranger because we were strangers in Egypt? How can we fail to welcome them, to make them feel like they're part of something because we remember what it felt like to be ostracized, to be different? And so it's imperative on us to also be welcoming and to be looking out for those who are suffering. And then when you look at the punishment for not being kind to the widow and the orphan, it's sort of, we get in one of the sort of commandments that we have in this week's Parsha, a pretty famous one is an eye for an eye. That if you knock out somebody's eye, basically that you need to compensate them for the value of what that eye would cost them. And here, when God is talking about not being kind to the widow and the orphan, and saying that as a result of that, God is going to make their family have a widow and have orphans, it is very similarly in sort of an eye for an eye type of transaction, showing how important it is to show kindness to the widow and the orphan, those people who are, again, often overlooked in society. And then we have the powerful line in the verses about the lending a garment where God says, "I shall listen, for I am compassionate." That when the poor person cries out to God, God is going to listen because God is compassionate. And as we learned in Bereshit, humans were created in the image of God, B'Tselem Elohim. And so we are supposed to emulate those good traits that God has. And here God is clearly showing that he is compassionate and that he is kind and that he hears the pain and suffering of those around him. And I think that that's the overarching lesson between these verses where we see so much emotion coming from God, whether that was sort of the rage he felt at people who are unkind to the widow and the orphan, whether it's the, again, that imperative call that we need to welcome and have empathy towards the stranger, or whether it is looking out for, not to take advantage of somebody who we lent to be compassionate. The overall theme there is compassion and kindness to others, to look out for our neighbors and to look out for the people who are not being looked after kindly, and to welcome them and to bring them in. And so I think that's a very beautiful and powerful lesson we can learn from this week's Parsha. I wish you all a wonderful week and a Shabbat Shalom, and I look forward to speaking with you next time.